God morgon. Då är det dags för den andra halvdagen av DIGSUM-Symposium då, som är dels en del i samhällsvetenskapliga fakultetens 50-årsjubileum. Jag fick den här lilla knappen av vår dekan igår. Så det är det jag vill visa här nu, att vi firar 50 år. Och precis som igår så har vi 2 föredrag. Och vi kör dem i rad, ett efter ett. Och så sen så blir det lite fika där nere, som redan är här nu. Så den där lilla förseningen. Sa vi det? Då gör vi inte som igår. Första föredraget, sen lite fika där nere, som redan har kommit. Sen det andra föredraget, och efter det så utifrån hur ni har anmält er eller utifrån hur ni känner idag, man behöver inte ha föranmält sig, så delar vi upp oss i 2 mindre grupper och har då diskussioner om de här 2 olika temana som har avhandlats. Då kommer den ena diskussionen att bli här ute och den andra inne i rummet här bakom. And the first speaker today is Lina Densik, who is actually Swedish by birth, but never lived in Sweden. She is based in Wales at the University of Cardiff, where she's the co-director of something called the Data Justice Lab. She's also a reader at the School for Communication and Journalism, and a third word I don't remember. Journalism, Media and Culture, yeah. And I mean, in this age of datafication that we obviously live in today, lots of issues of democracy and surveillance, and also some opportunities arise. So we're really happy to have you here to talk about these consequences for social justice in an age of datafication. So I'm going to welcome you up here, and
so let's see how many times I drop this on the floor. Okay, thank you very much, Simon, and thank you for the invitation also to be here. Yeah, so I am actually Swedish, but I've never been to this part of Sweden, I should also say. And I'm unfortunately not quite comfortable enough in Swedish to present academic work in Swedish. But hopefully it does mean that I can understand what's going to happen in the second session, which is useful. Anyway, so as Simon mentioned, I work at the Data Justice Lab at Cardiff University, which I'll just talk about a little bit what that is and what we do there. And then I'll talk a bit about predominantly some ideas around a project that I'm doing at the moment, which is funded by a European Research Council starting grant. We started in January, which is called Data Justice, Understanding Datafication in Relation to Social Justice. So I'll talk a bit about some of the, so we're still obviously relatively early on into the project, but I'll give a little bit of a rationale for why we are looking at it in those terms. And then some initial sort of thoughts about how we might think about data in relation to theories of justice. But first of all, just a little bit about the lab. So I work together with quite a few other people that you can see here, and the other co-directors of the lab is Arne Hintz, Joanna Redden, and we've also recently been joined by Emiliano Trere. So we have a sort of wide range of interests within the lab that all sort of unite around the idea of thinking about the implications of datafication for society, and perhaps particularly thinking about it in terms of questions of social justice, broadly speaking, and also democracy, which I think fits the theme for your event here as well. Just a few things to say about it. So we launched in March 2017, and we're actually, so this is also to explain where we come from a disciplinary sort of point of view. We're hosted within the journalism, media and culture, so we come to this topic really as media scholars who are interested in transformations happening with digital media and particularly this onus on data collection and what that means. And we have a number of different projects that looks at particularly questions of how data comes to play a part in how we're governed as citizens, which is a key kind of question for us and something I'll also talk about here. But also questions around sort of policies, questions around harms. So I'll mention this harms record, which my colleague Joanna Redden has written. And also with Emiliano's contribution, we're trying to expand our horizons a bit and go beyond just Europe, which has been our focus so far, and actually think about other parts of the world. But we did actually set up this lab in part in response to the very US-centered focus of these discussions so far, to try and get a more nuanced understanding of developments relating to data, particularly within sort of Europe, where things are not exactly the same as they are in the United States. So we also try and we're quite sort of a practice-oriented lab, meaning that we try and work with practitioners and particularly civil society organizations around some of these issues as well. So in addition to organizing academic events, we had a big conference in May on data justice, which brought together over 200 scholars and civil society organizations looking at that topic from lots of different angles. But in addition to that, we actually spent quite a lot of time trying to bring together different, what we might think of as stakeholders in the datafied society. And I'll come on to in my talk a little bit about how I think we need to think about who the stakeholders actually are a little bit differently than we've done so far, in terms of who's actually been allowed to drive a lot of the debate. And because we are in a journalism school, the other thing that we also try and do is work with, we're not particularly involved in the sort of journalism training part of the university or of the school, but we sit in the same department. And one of the issues that we think is quite important is the fact that a lot of the implications of datafication are hugely underreported in media, partly because it's very difficult to report on it. But one of the things that we try and do is then work with journalists to try and advance how we can report on this, because in many instances actually the process and the methods are the same as we would adopt in social science. So how can we transfer some of those types of investigatory skills over to journalism education, for example? So that's another thing that we do. So that's just a little bit about the Data Justice Lab, so you know where I'm coming from in this talk. But what I want to do then is just start out by giving a little bit of background as to why I've been interested in thinking about this idea of social justice and particularly sort of thinking about how social justice relates to datafication. And it actually comes from my background a little bit, or my background in this topic comes from looking at digital surveillance. And so I worked on a 2-year project called Digital Citizenship and Surveillance Society, UK State Media Citizen Relations after the Snowden leaks, which was about looking at the implications of the Snowden leaks, particularly in a UK context, but some of this I think is comparable to other countries, across different areas. So looking at questions of policy reforms that came out of the Snowden leaks, looking at reforms happening within technology, but particularly technical standards bodies, looking at news coverage of surveillance and data collection more broadly, and looking also at civil society responses, or what we call civil society, but predominantly that was public attitudes and knowledge towards mass data collection, and also views and attitudes amongst political activists as well. And one of the reasons we've termed this or framed this around this idea of digital citizenship was to also sort of recognize that whilst we are increasingly, our activity or participation in society as citizens is increasingly digitally mediated in one way or another, the way that that's often spoken about is this idea that we are engaging with our digital environments in order to participate and influence decisions that govern our lives, that these are tools that we can use to make our voice heard, we can feel empowered through our engagement with digital technologies and so forth. But what the Snowden leaks made very, very clear is that we're also made citizens in our engagement with digital technologies by being monitored, tracked, and subsequently categorized and profiled in lots of different ways that might influence how we're governed and decisions that are made about us. So that this kind of notion of digital citizenship needs to sort of take account of the ways in which we don't just use digital technologies, but we're made citizens through our engagement of digital technologies as well, through these digital traces that we leave behind and so forth that can be collected and analyzed. So suggesting a much more, I suppose, complex situation for particularly from the perspective of citizens. And just two things from this project that I want to point out that I think are important for going forward in understanding what is actually at stake with datafication and the datafied society. So the way that we think about, and we've just actually published a book based on this project that sort of situates this this debate along this, so it's called, I think, Digital Citizenship in a Datafied Society. And what we do in that book is actually situate the Snowden leaks as a moment or historical junction, if you like, in our understanding of the implications of our digital technologies. Because what we saw with the Snowden leaks, or what that made clear, something that a lot of people knew already, but it really sort of entered public debate, was the extent to which this kind of big data or big data surveillance, which what underpinned the Snowden leaks, have come to have huge implications for also how we're governed. Because what's important to know, to note about the Snowden leaks is that what they revealed is that we're dealing with a particular political economy of digital technologies, and that's a particular political economy that is driven by a business model that relies on the ability to collect and analyze lots and lots of data. And this is also what Zuzana Zuboff refers to as surveillance capitalism, which is to explain that we're actually talking about a new mode of capitalism or a new information order centered on a new accumulation logic based on the ability to collect and analyze data with the view to predict and modify human behavior as a way to generate revenue and gain market control. So we're dealing with a particular political and economic system or project, if you like, in this sense. And what the Snowden leaks revealed was that this then also has implications for how we're governed, because it was this political economy, that business model, that really made the types of surveillance programs that Snowden revealed possible, right? They underpinned, that political economy of digital technology underpinned the kind of surveillance programs that were revealed. That's, I think, is very important because it reveals the extent to which we need to understand this as something that isn't just inevitable or just happening, but is contingent on upon a particular political economy. The other thing that the Snowden leaks made very clear is also the extent and the normalization of data extractive technologies in our everyday lives. Because what the Snowden leaks revealed was that it was ordinary technologies that we all use in our everyday lives that also were at the heart of the surveillance programs that were revealed, which means that we also actively, if you like, participate. So people speak about participatory surveillance. We actively participate in the generation of data that is then collected and used to analyze. Right? And that implicates us obviously as citizens in quite complex ways, because we are then at the root of this, these technologies as well. And so that also means that, you know, David Lyon, the surveillance studies scholars, for example, has said about the Snowden leaks that what they push us to think about is the shift from a surveillance state or surveillance society, which sort of suggests that it's an outside actor looking down on us and so forth, to actually what we're talking about is a form of surveillance culture where being seen through data has become a way of life and something that shapes our mentalities and practices, right? So a much more intricate relationship to digital technologies and their consequences. Now, the thing that I looked at particularly as within this project was this question of public attitudes and civil society responses. And I just want to say something briefly about this, because this underpins really the rationale for thinking about data justice. So what I did was spoke to sort of ordinary members of the British public about their attitudes and understandings of mass data collection, but also political activists that who weren't actively engaged in digital rights issues and technology issues, but political, social justice broadly speaking. So environmental activists, labor activists, community activists, anti-discrimination activists, and so forth. Try and get a sense of what those people actually thought of these types of issues. And just to say briefly, sort of, you know, this is very crude sort of summary of some of the key findings from that. But one thing to note is the extent to which people did actually express quite a few concerns that they had about the nature of their digital environments and the lack of control that they feel. But actually, whilst having concerns, feel overwhelmingly resigned or disempowered to do much about it. So Nora Draper and Joe Turo, for example, in the United States have spoken about a sociology of digital resignation in how we should understand some of these responses, which actually suggests that this isn't that we're passive in this, but that we try and make pragmatic or create pragmatic responses with the overarching understanding that there isn't any fundamental change that we can do to how these digital technologies are actually designed or operate. I have spoken about it in some of my work as a form of surveillance realism, which draws on Mark Fisher's notion of capitalist realism, which he wrote in 2009 in the wake of the financial crisis, where he sort of bemoaned the fact that we're seeing all these injustices and fallacies with this system, but somehow we're incapable of imagining an alternative. And certainly in the UK, we saw a similar kind of public debate where lots of people were concerned or expressed concerns or saw fallacies with the nature of these digital technologies, but somehow we were unable to imagine an alternative. And the other thing that I think was important to mention in this research is when we spoke to political activists about their attitudes towards this mass data collection, what was interesting was that they actually largely saw these questions as something that didn't particularly concern them. So they sort of outsourced these issues around digital technology, data, surveillance, and so forth to digital rights groups or technology activists. Sort of that's what they're concerned with. Our agenda is about something else. And as I'll go on to explain, I think this is hugely problematic because the consequences of datafication actually implicate also social justice activists more broadly. So this disconnect, if you like, in civil society between technology and digital rights activists on the one hand and social justice activists on the other is quite problematic. And the whole idea or one of the key ideas behind setting up the Data Justice Lab was precisely to try and overcome this disconnect and actually try and identify how these types of developments have huge implications and consequences also for social justice agendas more broadly. Hence the term data justice, right? Okay, and particularly this is becoming important because we're seeing, whilst the Snowden leaks were concerned with intelligence and security, this logic of governing through data, if you like, and mass collection of data is something we're seeing across social life now and has implications in all kinds of aspects of our lives. So these are sort of news stories that we've had in the last couple of years that illustrate the extent to which, you know, data collection now has something or influences decisions that can potentially impact our participation in society in quite fundamental ways, in terms of whether we get hired or fired for a job, whether we can cross a border, or even potentially if we go to prison or not. So down there you have the very famous ProPublica story from 2016, which I looked at the use of algorithmic decision-making in criminal justice systems in the United States in order to determine whether someone should get bail or not, right? To try and predict how likely it is that someone's going to reoffend. This kind of logic of data-driven decision-making or data-informed decision-making even, or the idea of trying to predict risk and threats based on lots of data collection is increasingly something that we're dealing with in lots of different areas and not just in the United States. This story here from The Guardian is about the United Kingdom that was published just a couple of months ago that looks at this use of data-driven risk scores in child welfare, for example, trying to predict what children might be vulnerable to exploitation and so forth, right? So this is something that we need to think of across social life. So this idea of the datafied society is trying to sort of speak to that. And it suggests, therefore, that we do need to have a broader group of stakeholders involved in the discussions, and it can't be confined to digital rights and technology activists to think about the implications of this kind of shift in governance. Because this isn't just a technical question, and this is just, I suppose, something that you might be familiar with already, so I don't need to labor the point, but of course, we know from critical data studies that this idea of using data to tell us something about the social world is based on some very fundamental assumptions that also have huge implications for democracy, if you like, but also it's ideological, right? Because there are some fundamental ideas that underpin the idea that you can actually govern or collect data about people and therefore say something about how they might behave in the future and make decisions about them based on that. And it's rooted in the premise that it's possible to abstract social relations into data points that can be algorithmically processed, which is a fundamental assumption about then the relationship between data and people, that it's possible to aggregate data about group traits, about lots and lots of different people in order to predict individual behavior, right? And that relies on the reduction of identities, mobilities, and practices to data points that can be algorithmically processed. I think this is important to remember. So that isn't just a technical question about, it's just about more information that's processed faster. It's actually a very fundamentally an epistemological and ontological understanding we're talking about, right? This is a particular way of understanding the social world and understanding the relationship between people and the information that we can gather about them. The other thing that I think is important when you start thinking about data-driven governance in this way is that we're talking about also a temporal shift in politics. So what we're moving from with this is an onus of from reactive to proactive forms of governance. Also Brian Masumi, the philosopher, has talked about an operative logic of preemption being the dominant mode or operative logic of politics, particularly post 9/11, but that's really pushed through with these data-driven technologies, where the idea is that, you know, the value of big data for governance is precisely what we might think of as the sort of epistemic capabilities of algorithms to somehow conjecture threats or risks that might happen in the future, right? That we think that it's possible that through algorithmic processes that we can understand future threats in some way. So we're shifting, you know, and that it's a sort of the appeal of a lot of these types of systems comes from this idea that we don't have to be reactive, we can be proactive, and we can preempt activity and behavior. And that's also its appeal from a market, corporate point of view. And then finally, that what we're talking about then is the idea of an increasing emphasis that what governance is about is really about managing these risks then that are somehow predicted or conjectured through these types of systems. And that it's really, we transfer then sovereignty and authority to this kind of these new devices that calculate risk for us. So it's not that the risks are necessarily new, but the way that they are calculated is new, and they are granted, that calculus of risk is granted authority and sovereignty within governance, seen as an expert form of knowledge. So that is just to say that we have to think of this not as a technical shift, but as a political shift. Data-driven governance is part of a broader political transformation, right? It has something fundamental to say about the relationship between citizens and state and capital. So what is then at stake? Well, when we looked at something like the Snowden leaks, for example, in the aftermath of that, we were offered a quite simple binary, really, in terms of what's at stake with mass data collection and analysis for the purposes of governance. And that's predominantly the one that I think we're all quite familiar with, that this is a question of more efficient services or greater security, particularly state security, on the one hand, that this is what the benefits are, and what the problems might be or the concern might be is predominantly one of individual privacy. So this kind of idea that what we're dealing with here is efficiency and security on the one hand, and a concern with individual privacy, the protection of personal data on the other. Well, I think that the developments and the sort of understanding of the broader transformations that are going on have suggested that probably this is too limited a framing for what is actually at stake. And we've had a bunch of literature recently that have really pointed to this by highlighting the extent to which this isn't really just a question of individual privacy, but actually these types of developments also introduce fundamental questions about discrimination, for example. So the extent to which discrimination can happen through the use of historically biased or skewed data, or the way that certain variables are weighted in algorithms that produce discriminatory outcomes that harm certain groups, or at least it's likely that certain groups will be targeted more than others, that highlight the extent to which this is part of a broader shift in inequality, or that these developments are reliant on an inherent power asymmetry between those who are able to collect and use and analyze data versus those who are profiled and subject to that type of data analysis, who often have no idea what data about them is being collected and how that's used and how that might impact them in their lives. Which suggests a huge, an inherent question for democracy, of course, in terms of how can this then be accountable, what type of scrutiny can we, and oversight is possible. And also just how increasingly our identities is reduced to kind of, this is the John Cheney-Lippold book, We Are Data, how our identities are reduced to sort of algorithmic forms of identities, which also is not just a question of privacy, but really a question of how we're recognized in society. My colleague Joanna Redden, as I mentioned, has a data harms record, which is on the Data Justice Lab website, and it's an ongoing record where she's trying to sort of collect concrete examples of types of different harms we might be talking about when we are looking at developments with data. And so what I think these types of texts and these kinds of debates really suggest is that we're really dealing with a broader question of social justice here, right? That this is really broader social justice questions, questions of democracy, questions of how certain groups are disproportionately impacted by this. And it really, pushes back on the idea, which was very prominent in the aftermath of the Snowden leaks, that with mass surveillance, we're all somehow equally implicated in this, right? That it's all of us, it's all our individual privacy, and we're all the same in this. Actually, of course, that's not the case, right? These types of systems and developments are contingent on inequalities, and these things don't fall on smooth ground, as Virginia Eubanks says in Automating Inequality. We're not all equally positioned in how to negotiate and deal with the implications of a datafied society, and we're not all targeted the same way either. So how should we then approach these types of discussions? And this is where my media studies background probably comes into play quite a lot, because one of the issues with the way that this has been studied is that so far there's been quite a strong focus on looking and understanding these issues through the technology itself. So looking at the data systems, looking at the algorithms to try and understand the impact of data system and algorithmic processes. Tony Monahan talks about a sort of algorithmic fetishism, right, that we have, that we want to open the black box, and this is really how we should understand the implications. Well, what I found in my research anyway is that this will only give us a very limited understanding of the impact of this, and even give us a very limited understanding of how these systems work. And what we really need to do is situate data and the systems that rely on data that are used for decision making within particular social and institutional context in order to really understand what is going on. And so I draw here on Nick Coldry's famous work on media practice as an approach, which was really a response to sort of move away from the idea that we can understand, for example, the effects of media and the impact of media by looking just at media text, or even looking just at the institutions that produce media, so the sort of very reductionist political economy approach. And actually what we need to do is ask, what do people do with media? And therefore decenter media in our understanding of the impact of this. And I would say similarly, when it comes to questions of data and datafication, we really need to decenter data here, because I think what we need to do much more is try and understand, what do people actually do with these systems, right? And more importantly, how do the practices that emerge in relation to data actually relate to other social practices and relate to institutional context? Because it's only really through that we can understand how they're used and what the implications actually are, how they inform decision making, and so forth. And because one of the things that I found in my research is that, of course, it's not that these systems are implemented, say, for example, for policing, and then they just do whatever it is the system wants, the police to do. These things are always negotiated, because you're dealing with professionals who have their own understanding of professional judgment, who understand technology in different ways, who have different imaginaries surrounding algorithms and so forth. And so, of course, there are lots of different places in which we have to understand the politics of data. It isn't just in the data system itself, it's really in the relation between data practices and other social practices. So we need to politicize really these data systems as sites of struggle. We have to ask much more, why are these technologies implemented in the first place, and what kind of agenda is it serving, right? Those types of questions I think we've not really had enough of. And so what I'm doing in my project, just to give sort of an overview of what we're doing, is to try and actually put this into practice by looking at different case studies, and these are the topics that we are dealing with. So what we're trying to do is sort of, yes, look at the technology, look at the companies that are also being contracted for supplying these technologies, do analysis of how the algorithms work as much as that is possible. Of course, it's hugely problematic in terms of access and so forth, and what type of data is actually being used. But to actually situate that then within certain institutional context and look at practices, look at how this then is used in practice, and then linking that to actual experiences. Something we really don't have very much of is to try and get a sense of what then is the impact of this on people's lives. And then trying to understand how then this introduces political questions and questions of policy. And we're looking at these different topics because we're sort of taking the position of marginalized, historically underrepresented and resource-poor communities for the simple reason in some ways in that that's where a lot of experimentation with data-driven governance takes place. So refugee populations on the outskirts of Europe, for example, are some of the most tracked and collected populations you'll find. So we're looking at that. We're looking also at law enforcement policing because there's been lots of issues there around discrimination. So there we're looking particularly at ethnic minorities and how they experience this shift. And then also low-wage work, where we're seeing increasingly the introduction of algorithmic management structures in precarious work. And so to try and sort of understand how the actual sort of empirically what is actually happening on the ground in this datafied society and how is that then experienced, and then try and think about what does that mean for how we think about justice issues. Now, the reason we're doing that is also then to try and think about resistance differently. Because what we also saw in the aftermath of the Snowden leaks is that there was a particular type of response to data collection. And predominantly what we saw was the proliferation of alternative or encryption technologies going into the mainstream, if you like, amongst activists and citizens alike. So the idea there being that somehow you could fight back against data collection by encrypting, using encrypted alternative technologies. We also saw some real efforts by digital rights groups to try and lobby around particular aspects of policy reform, particularly to do with data protection. And then we've seen in more recently, perhaps, the sort of growth of data activism, so the idea that what we might do is revert the power relations by using the same techniques that are used to govern us, by using data collection to advance alternative agendas, so social justice agendas. Now, I think all of these are useful, but also quite limited. So, you know, in terms of sort of using encrypted technologies or tech activism of that form, for example, often suggests that the onus is on the individual user to protect their own privacy. And it's kind of a very individualistic and atomized understanding of data and how you know, how we interact with our digital environments that perhaps doesn't fully appreciate the relational aspects of data. Data gets value through its relational aspects, and you know, suggests a more need for a more collective response. Whereas policy activism, particularly around these types of issues, tend to require a lot of technical expertise, and we found was quite confined within a very small expert community, and didn't really incorporate larger parts of society. And data activism does a lot to sort of suggest how we can revert some power relations, but doesn't fundamentally respond to the challenges of living in a datafied society. In many ways extends that logic through also activism. Now, so what we're seeing then is recently an emerging response that tries to cope or deal with these more broader societal questions around discrimination, transparency, accountability, and so forth, emerging in this notion of data ethics, which has really taken off recently. You know, we have hundreds of data ethics initiatives. I'm sure there are also some in Sweden, that, you know, one interviewee we spoke with about this said, you know, we have now like a marketplace of data ethics initiatives, right? Which one should you choose, even as a practitioner or a developer? It's not entirely clear. But I think data ethics an idea has some value, but I think we have to be alert to the ways in which that's also being operationalized in particular ways that is perhaps also quite limited. So in one way, what we're seeing a lot of is the idea that what we need is to somehow audit algorithms and then de-bias machine learning and create fairness by design. So we have a huge community of engineers emerging who are trying to sort of understand or create computational notions of fairness, right? But there, I think, you know, we have to sort of question the value of that, because what it suggests is that these types of social issues that I've discussed have a kind of technical fix. And if we can just either have more data or tweak the algorithm a little, then none of these challenges that we've talked about will be there. And I don't think that the nature of those challenges suggests that that's possible. And I think we also have to be alert that that's quite an industry-driven understanding of the issues, because, of course, the technology industry is very happy for us to think about these issues as being about technology and therefore can have a technological fix. They're quite happy to provide us with solutions to lots of social problems, right? The other thing that's happening is this idea of training engineers and developing curricula and so forth, that I think is interesting, but I think also, you know, I think we have to question what's the sort of idea of social change there, that if we just have sort of more, I don't know, morally conscious engineers, that somehow, you know, the pressures of working in a particular type of sector isn't going to have any impact. I think also perhaps we need to think about, and then the other thing is this idea of developing guidelines and principles. And the reason that I'm skeptical around that is also because I'm speaking to digital rights and other types of activists about this. They seem to suggest that a lot of this is really also just about avoiding regulation. So that's a form of self-regulation, really, that, you know, again, if we develop some guidelines and codes of ethics, then therefore we don't need more substantial reform and pushback. So now I think in the United States there's a lot of debate about the extent to which data ethics has actually neutralized or depoliticized some of the challenges that we are facing. So I don't have a huge amount of time, but just if you are going to start the next one at 10, but I think what we enter into with this, in this context, this idea of looking at it in terms of social justice, and I think fundamentally it's about reframing the type of resistance or the nature of resistance within a datafied society, but also to sort of, I suppose, politicize more overtly some of the challenges that we are facing. And this is really just early days, but we're trying to sort of think about how does data relate to you know, established theories of justice. And what we're drawing from here is not the sort of Rawlsian notion of justice, which would suggest that this is about sort of distributing data as a good differently amongst people, but actually look at it more in this kind of substantial way, where also drawing on some feminist critiques and of that kind of distributive paradigm that questions, well, actually, so Nancy Fraser wrote about abnormal justice in 2008, which was looking at how globalization disrupts really fundamental assumptions we've made about justice and forces us to question the basics, the language, the grammar, as she says, of justice. And we're thinking about, well, actually data in some ways does the same. Data also makes us question, what are we even talking about when we're talking about justice in a datafied society? We can't even agree on what data is most of the time, right? Is it a public good? Is it a private good? Is it something therefore that can be distributed? Increasingly we talk about data as a relation, a form of social relation. So even here we have a sort of basic question of ontology that's at the heart of datafication, that there are now, it's up for grabs, if you like. And also, who are we talking about when we're talking about justice in a datafied society? So who is the data subject, right? Here we also have no clear answers to that. Is it really appropriate to think of an individual data subject, or do we need to think about it more collectively? What is the jurisdiction of a data subject? You know, is it, we know within EU, for example, how difficult it is to set off those types of parameters, those types of jurisdictions in the datafied society because of the way the data travels globally. But also, how should we even make justice claims in a datafied society? So what are the appropriate avenues to do that? Is it law or is it the courts? That's criticized often because many reasons we don't have a lot of regulations around machine learning and data is often because it's too complex. Right? So who should be making these types of decisions? We seem to be giving a lot of authority to engineers and developers themselves to decide what fairness is for us and to deal with these kinds of justice claims. But actually, I think there's a lot of questions as to what is the correct procedure for making justice claims in a datafied society. And so the sort of thing that we're trying to do with our project is to actually, well, let's start by looking at these empirical sites and identify what are claims of injustice amongst groups who experience oppression and domination, to use Iris Marion Young's language, right? So actually situate how these systems are being implemented within conditions of oppression and domination as a historical continuation of that form of governance, actually, and those types of structures. And then start thinking about, so this is how we think about data justice, that is about thinking about data as part of integrated social justice agendas. So what would it mean, for example, for a welfare rights agenda to think about data? What kinds of issues need to be raised if you want to advance welfare rights? That would be the kind of thing. So to talk to people who are concerned with welfare rights and talk with people who are concerned with data and identify common concerns. What would data look like in that type of agenda? Or in a labor agenda, for example, workers' rights agenda. What are the issues around data in a workers' rights agenda or a migrant solidarity agenda, right? So these types of looking at different parts of social justice, looking at different as parts of civil society and trying to think about what does data mean from that type of perspective. And so that means that we do a lot of work with these different groups to try and get a better understanding of that. I'm conscious that you're standing there, so I'll finish on that note. Is that good? That'll be the end of it. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Lina, for this presentation. I'm sure it resonates quite a bit in various ways with all the different things that people in this group are dealing with. As we chose this layout for these days where we have this actual question session afterwards, it becomes a bit odd to open up now as well, but if there is any immediate question that someone would like to post now. Yeah, Greg, you want this for the microphone for that?
I was wondering if you had any thoughts or quick comments about this Chinese social credit system, which seems to be a prime example of what you're talking about, and if I understand it correctly, even holds elements of public shaming built into the system.
Yeah, I mean, it's overtly, I mean, what I think is interesting is that a lot of the news articles and this is kind of underpinned by xenophobia, really, of like, oh, look at what they're doing in China, isn't it horrendous, and so forth. And it's obviously imbued with lots of very overt ideas of what makes a good citizen. So this idea of you have to treat your elderly with respect, you get higher points, and these types of things. And so people talk about this as a kind of gamification of citizenship, right? You need to live your life to get a high score. And of course, that is, if you like, the sort of extreme end of where you can take some of these, particularly within a very particular state structure. But I think what's interesting is that we actually see aspects of this also within Europe and within the UK, where I live, where we also have this idea of citizen scoring. I've just actually been working on a project that looks at how, for example, within public services in the UK, you have now increasingly these risk scores, vulnerability scores, things like this that are actually based on attributes and characteristics of people like you in order to sort of say something about who you might be in the future and how risky you might be to society. And that gets a lot of criticism from sort of people who are concerned with welfare rights and poverty issues, for example, because many instances it's essentially living in poverty makes you risky, algorithmically speaking, and those features. So I think this idea of scoring is actually something that is quite widespread. But of course, the Chinese social credits score seems particularly, because it's so centralized as well. And I think that's one of the things. And of course, it's also structurally, just to say, it's obviously very different in many ways Here, I mean, in the UK, we see that in many instances you're outsourcing companies to do some of the, or provide the technologies for this. So the setup between state and capital is quite different, and where the accountability therefore lies and the decision-making lies is different. But I think the logic behind it is also here. Yeah.
Thank you. So this is then time for the short coffee break. I think we'll adjust the schedule a little bit so that we return to these seats at 10:10 for the next presentation. And then once that presentation ends, those who want to discuss these issues further with Lina will join her and Rasmus, who will chair that discussion in this room just behind the screen. So that will be not after the coffee, but after the presentation, after the coffee. So, thank you.
Got it.